Hello everyone, today we're going to do a thorough review of OOTP defense. I'm going to be discussing which positions are important, how important each position is, what works at each position, and essentially how to get the most out of your team, not just with the defense, but where you can also slide in some offense. Ultimately just general strategy based on how OOTP defense functions. Now, the last time I made a video on defense, we looked at the 23 beta, which was a lot of tweaks being made by OOTP on defense. A lot of things have changed since then, both over the 23 cycle and coming into 24. So we're going to discuss all of that today and ultimately what essentially you're going to be looking for at each position. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into it. So first up, we're going to be discussing defensive positions or positions where you're going to highly prioritize the glove over a bat. So at these positions, I would say especially shortstop and center field, you're looking almost exclusively at how effective a fielder the person is because the value of the defense you're getting is going to far outweigh any offense you could possibly get at the position. With second base, I'd say defensive value outweighs offensive value, but it's a little bit less than it was, or than shortstop and center field, I should say. So we'll start with shortstop here. Shortstop has ever since the catcher ability nerf in 23 and its own slight increase to prevalence been the top defensive position in the entire game by a very, very significant margin. I don't think that anything comes even close. Even center field is not particularly close, in my opinion, to shortstop in terms of its overall value. But ultimately, what we're looking at here is range, arm, turn double plays, even to some extent air, all massively impactful in terms of the value you can get. Top tier fielders can add 6 to 7, sometimes even a little more than that, wins worth of value with their glove. In offline leagues, it's always, always, always going to be worth getting that defensive shortstop because the value defense is just not properly valued by the OTP engine. It's very easy to get guys who are excellent fielders, mediocre hitters, but they're best in position and get them on an extreme discount because the AI, the financial logic, it just does not properly appreciate shortstop defensive value. Now, next up is center field, and there is a significant gap between shortstop and center field these days in terms of how valuable they are. Shortstop is a very distant number one. I would say probably the most distant number one since catcher in OTP 21 or 22 when it was at the height of catcher ability value. But anyways, center field is still extremely valuable. You can get around 5 wins out of a particularly valuable center fielder. Now, you're not just looking at defense, especially because at shortstop, you're looking at a number of defensive ratings to determine what makes a good shortstop. In center field, you're looking at range. That's almost exclusively going to make up the value of a center fielder defensively. So with that in mind, there's going to be a lot more guys with that high enough range to qualify as an elite center fielder. So there is some offensive value coming into your evaluation of center field, but ultimately it's just going to be choosing between two guys who are elite defenders, really, more than it is at shortstop, where the number of truly elite defenders is a lot lower than center field. So because that bar is higher and there's more options available with the elite defense, you can usually get away with taking some offense, potentially at the cost of a little less defense for an overall more valuable player at the position. But anyways, next up we got second base. And second base recently joined this list. It used to be actually number of positions lower on my evaluations. I did not think second base defense was particularly valuable, but that has changed. I think both in the way that OTP has tweaked their engine and in the ways that I evaluated defense in the past. I believe second base was slightly undervalued just by nature of how I built my testing environments. But anyways, I now believe that second base is in the same ballpark as shortstop and center field. I mean, you're not going to get the 5 wins of center field. You're not going to get the 6 to 7 of shortstop. We can still manage, I'd say maybe a 4-ish wins around that defensively with a really good fielder. Second base, again, like shortstop, you're getting a lot of things involved in your defensive evaluations as opposed to center field where it's pretty much just range. Besides second base, range is absolutely number one. It's not as complex as shortstop, but turn double plays is more valuable than shortstop because more often than not, you're going to receive throws from second base or from shortstop, from third base, rather than from just the second baseman or the first baseman like you would as a shortstop. So turn double play is very important at second base as well. Error, I think, is probably the most overvalued rating at shortstop. It absolutely has its place. It provides some value, especially with those higher range players, but error by itself is not a revolutionary rating. Arm, I think, is actually potentially slightly undervalued. In my defensive metrics in the past, I had second base arm as very minimal value. I think that's a slight understatement of the value. I think it's above error. I don't think it's a huge difference, but I do think that second base arm does carry some value. So again, you want those players with more things overall, but absolutely the range, turn double plays, profiles do play at second base, unlike shortstop. So those types of guys certainly worth picking up. Anyways, second base, like center field, I think there is some offensive value to be had. I think in OOTP right now, shortstop is really the only position where you can truly throw offense in favor of defense. Things have become a little bit better balanced out, although I do think, again, defense hugely outweighs offense at second base and center field. But in center field, you have a large number of options where you can choose from. So therefore, because the number of defensive center fielders there's so many of them, you have more flexibility in getting offense from the position. But at second base, because it's not as dominant a defensive position as shortstop or center field, it's not quite on the same level, although I do group it in the same category here. There is value to be had in offense. You have an elite offensive second baseman who is, I would say, an average to above average fielder. That's probably worth playing. But you can't quite kick the defense. It certainly does outweigh the offense in value most of the time. So that is certainly something to consider. And there is still value in going all in on the defense. You can absolutely do that. Just will probably not be the best player in the league unless it also happens to be a great hitter. Anyways, next category up, we've got the balanced positions where I believe defense and offense provide similar enough value, so you're going to be looking for some combination of both. And this group has become a lot larger in recent years of OOTP, which leads me to believe OOTP is looking to not devalue defense, but rather uniformize. I can't think of the word, but whatever the value of defense at positions across the board. Number one on this list is catcher. And this may surprise some people because in the 23 beta, I absolutely torched catcher's defensive value. I stated that I was going to start looking for offensive catchers, and I have actually done that since. But here it is back as my number 4, so middle of the pack defensive value position. I think catcher has bounced back a little since the 23 beta in terms of what we're getting from framing value. It's not at 22 levels. My models from 22 had it as up to an 8 WAR just from framing value defensively, which is ridiculous. Now it's more in the 2 to 3 WAR value, but this is a huge thing. With catcher, the value of this position relatively does change depending on the rest of your team. That is not true with most of the other positions. They're going to be roughly the same regardless of your construction. I know that a lot of people talk about like fly ball pitchers, but even so, that's not going to change the value of your outfield that much relative to the value of your infield. But anyways, as I was saying, with catchers, if you have especially with 24's engine, because stuff pitching is just absolutely busted right now, and control is not so great. So you can get away with pitchers who have off the chart stuff and garbage control like you never could before. Catchers with that kind of staff, which is undervalued, it's extremely effective, they become even more valuable. I'd certainly bump them above second base into the defense first positions even. Not quite back up again all the way to the level of value that it was at 22, even with the perfect conditions for it, but it can't be more valuable. On the other hand, you build a staff with complete control pitchers, high movement, which is totally viable. Probably drops below, and I just realized I have second base on here twice. That is a mistake. This should be third base. Anyways, if catcher were to be on a staff with more control pitchers, more movement, less strikeout focus, you are going to see the value of the position drop below right field. I don't think it quite drops below left field, but it's definitely an offensive first position at that point. And yeah, certainly depends on the makeup of your staff. But anyways, I know I've heard a lot of people say that you want to even look at an arm first catcher. I am here to completely dispel these conspiracy theories. Arm is not the dominant defensive value metric at catcher. It never has been. It never will be. People, please stop promoting arm as the top defensive rating for this position. It has value, but it will never be worth more than framing until they install robo umps into OOTP and framing goes away entirely. It's just the value of framing, even significantly brought down, is still just way, way, way greater than arm. And even with those staffs where you have a ridiculous amount of control and movement with no stuff, framing is still better. It's going to be closer, but you're certainly not going to look at a catcher, see their arm right off the framing, and just sign them for an arm. And you certainly are not looking for a defense first catcher whose primary value is their arm. That's just absurd to me that this is becoming a thing at all in OTP circles. I have seen it places. Please, if you're watching this, do not consider arm to be such a heavily important rating. Now, anyways, overall, I think the package of catcher is a step below second base. I think actually the difference between second base and catcher is much less than the difference between center field and second base. But we are now at the point where offense becomes a more significant consideration at the position, especially depending on your makeup. It becomes worth it to look for a catcher who provides at least a little bit of hitting. Now, going back to previous me talking about catcher ability as the money ball of OTP, it was the money ball because it was cheap, and it's still cheap, just like all other defense. Shortstop is now, in my opinion, the true money ball of OTP, but you could still get great value out of a defensive catcher. Keep in mind, just like back then, as I said, catchers only start like 120 games a year at best versus other positions, which can go 140, 150. So if you're going to pay a catcher 30 mil, like Adley Rutschman, he's a great defensive catcher who hits extremely well. But if you want to sign him to a contract, he's going to cost you $45 million a year. Do you really want that for someone who's going to start 120 games a season? Now, he's massively impactful, absolutely, on both sides of the ball. But again, it's that question of the money. Can you spend that money more effectively at other positions? And again, with just offense first catchers, like, are you going to sign a guy to be $20 million a year to be a hitter when you can get someone who's a little worse overall, defense first, an Austin Hedges type for $5 million a year or less? Anyways, next up we got third base, which is the last position where I believe defense is probably outweighing offense most of the time. Or it's strongly considered, I should say. I think offense at third base is firmly more valuable than defense. You absolutely want a third baseman who can hit when you can get him, but you still want someone who can field. Arm at third base is far more important than any other rating, which is, by the way, third base is the only position where arm is more important than range, or anything is more important than range, actually. But at third base, arm is more important than range. Range is still secondary importance. Error is okay. Turn no plays does nothing. But if you get a catcher with a cannon of an arm, mediocre range, and a huge bat, that's valuable. Or excuse me, not a catcher, a third baseman. Third base, I'd say you can get maybe 2.5 to 3 WAR defensive value out of a stronger fielder who fits the profile well. Definitely not as valuable again as catcher, second base. There's a gap between catcher and third base for sure. And yeah, you're looking for certainly a balance of offense and defense where possible, but you can even go all in on the offense and be perfectly fine at the position. So we got right field next as well. Um, I believe, like I said, the drop between catcher and third base is significant. The drop between third base and right field, fairly significant. You can still get decent value out of your right fielders. Arm becomes more valuable relative to range, but range is still certainly the most valuable thing in right field as well. You can make up for some lost range with arm, but it's questionable in terms of your overall defensive value. For the most part, I believe you're looking for someone with ideally at least 55 range. You can get more, awesome, but the bat certainly outweighs the glove at this point. Left field is the funkiest position of all defensively. And the reason for that is simply because the value of defense does not apply linearly and does not make sense to me. In the past, I have put left field as a nearly useless defensive position because once you, in my models, there was one blip and everything else, no matter how much you changed your range, minimal impact on defense, or defensive war rather. But since then, I have confirmed with other people. I've run my data over and over again and tested my environments repeatedly and used different environments. And I am now 100% confident that for whatever reason, between 45 and 55 range in left field, it's more high 45, low 55 range. You are going to see a massive decrease or a massive change in defensive war of about 2 to 2.5, which to me is absolutely obscene that it's that much. If you get a ranged left fielder over 55, you're not going to see much of a change, but you absolutely have to have that 55 in left field. So for that, as a bare minimum, I would rather sink that low range in right field, frankly, than left field because the impact is going to be less. Left field is absolutely a position where you want to get a big bat as long as you have that 55 minimum range. That is the one requirement, but it is such a necessary requirement that still lands itself in the balanced positions category. Anyways, next up, the offensive category, or the offense first positions, the places you're looking for offense almost exclusively. And now we're down to two because I've decided to promote left field, and those are first base and the most obvious designated hitter. First base, defense absolutely does provide value, and it absolutely does not provide much value. So I've seen rumors on both sides where people claim that first base is absolutely as useful as other positions defensively. It's not. Any model you will see has it graded well below any other position on the field. I've not seen anyone claim it to be extremely valuable data. And there are people who say that first base is basically designated hitter, or is designated a designated hitter spot where you just put literally anybody. That's not exactly true either. I would say it's closer to the reality than the people claiming that first base is a valuable defensive position. Couple things about first base. Range and height are the two things that make any kind of impact. Range is absolutely the bigger one. Height has some effect on defensive value. Error has a very minimal effect. Arm has an immeasurably small effect. I know it has an effect, but it's so rarely used that it doesn't make much difference. Turn to plays is completely irrelevant. But anyways, you're looking at up to one defensive war difference between a bad defensive first baseman and a pretty good defensive first baseman. So there's some value to be had there. It's worth considering between two players of similar bats, which is usually how I do it. I'm going to look for the best hitter I can. And if there are people who are pretty similar, I'm going to look at the best fielder. But I am willing to use first base as a second designated hitter spot under specific circumstances. For example, I've got two dominant hitters that can't really play any other position. I'm going to stick one at first base probably. Another thing, which I'll get to in a minute with the designated hitter. First base can occasionally, with super ridiculous hitters, be worth using a guy at over designated hitter, even if their defense is bad and you have better defensive options. Now, with designated hitter, there's no defense involved, obviously, but there is a very slight penalty to a player's performance offensively from the spot. For whatever reason, OOTP decided to do that. So if you have someone at designated hitter, expect them to slightly underperform their offensive ratings. So that gets to my point here. I would rather play a truly dominant hitter at first base sometimes than designated hitter because they will not suffer the designated hitter penalty. So that is one thing you can do. I don't generally recommend it, but in very rare cases where you have a hitter who's just leagues above everyone else, like a 10 WAR hitter, designated hitter penalty might be enough that it more than makes up for the defensive cost of playing someone awful at first base. Anyways, with that, we're going to go ahead and get to our concluding points here, where I'm going to discuss position by position ratings, what ratings are important, what to look for generally in your fielders, what makes a fielder effective. So I'm going to start by talking about ratings, and then we're going to go back and I'm going to define what a good fielder looks like at every position in my eyes, what the minimum defense I'm looking for is going to be, and another thing, just positional ratings. We'll discuss those very briefly. All right, anyways, critical ratings. The number one is range. There is no position where range is not important. It absolutely has value everywhere. It's the first thing you want to look at on a player's defensive card because it's going to tell you that is, in my opinion, the way you should think about it is range sets a baseline for how your player is going to perform. Everything else goes off the range. This is how good the player is defensively. Arm, error, turn double plays, those are modifiers on a player's ability. I'm going to convert X WAR plays that I get to outs with a good arm, or I'm going to throw out a certain number of base runners from the outfield via assists. Or turn double plays isn't really a range modifier so much, but it is certainly more valuable when you have higher range when your other side of the infield has higher range because they're going to get to more balls. You're going to have a greater opportunity to turn those plays into double plays. But overall, range is what sets the tone for a fielder's quality. Error only matters as your range gets higher. If you're a player with low range, you're not going to get to enough balls for error to matter. You're not going to get to hard enough balls for error to matter. But as you start making more and more difficult plays, that error becomes a greater factor. And the biggest reason for that is because, think about it this way. On a normal routine play, which anyone with any range is going to get to, you pick up the ball, you throw it to first base. Neither of those things are difficult. But on a difficult play where you dive for a ball, and then you have to get up and throw it to first base at a difficult spot with rushed timing, you have to have good error to avoid making an error on getting the play in the first or getting the ball up in the first place, and then you have to avoid making an error on a tough throw. So that's two error checks right there that are going to happen a lot more frequently with players with greater range. So yeah, error has a spot with particularly high-ranged players, but otherwise, I mean, even with the higher range players, the arm is always going to be more of a difference maker than the range, or the error anyways. Infield and outfield are very different in terms of how you analyze them. Outfield range is pretty much the only rating that really, I mean, you can totally just evaluate outfielders on range, especially center field and left field, and be totally fine. With the infield, obviously, there's a lot more to it at every position except obviously first base. But even first base, height is somewhat of a factor. Error is somewhat of a factor. So you can't quite just evaluate infielders on their range like you can outfielders. And catcher ability is still the supreme rating at the position. Now, and I think really the big thing with catchers, I would claim right now that center field range and shortstop range are the two most dominant singular ratings in the game. Nothing impacts a player's value as much as those two ratings. But catcher ability is absolutely up there with shortstop arm, third base arm, the second tier of defensive range, second base range. It's up there with that too. It's absolutely there with that second tier of defensive ratings. The problem with catcher overall is that there's two ratings that give a catcher value, and the arm is just not pulling its weight very much compared to the catcher ability. If catcher had 4 ratings and there was catcher ability and then 3 ratings that had as much value as the arm, it would absolutely be as valuable, if not more valuable, in second base still. It's just at a disadvantage because of that simple fact. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and go position by position and talk about what each rating does and how important they are, what I'm looking for in a fielder. So first up, we're going to go back to the beginning here. We got shortstop. So at shortstop, everything is important. Error is absolutely dead last, but it still has an effect because, like I said earlier, error checks get used a lot for good defensive shortstops. So what am I looking for here? Range is absolutely number 1 and arm is absolutely number 2. Arm is horribly undervalued in the shortstop positional rating an OOTP uses, which brings me to another point. Do not value players solely on their positional rating. It does not actually reflect the value of their player. Arm is way better at shortstop than turn double plays or error, and yet those two things are valued. Actually, I think turn double plays is valued more heavily than arm in positional rating, which to me is ridiculous that OTP would have that, but regardless, players with high range and high arm at shortstop are going to be very effective, even if they don't have error or turn double plays, because they're going to be able to convert so many more outs than an average player would. And their positional rating may not reflect that. So in online leagues in particular, guys who are going to be of that profile are great targets because other people might look at them and see a 70 positional rating or something when they're really more like a 75 or an 80 in terms of their true ability. They might be willing to give them up. But anyways, shortstop, range, and arm are absolutely dominant. Turn double plays has an impact, error has an impact. They'll both affect much fewer plays overall, but they're still quite valuable. You ideally want a player who has all 4 high, especially range, turn double plays, arm. That's going to be a dominant defensive impact from a player. And have a solid error. If you've got like a 60 error, that's plenty fine for most cases. Next up, center field. I'm almost exclusively looking at range here. Now, like shortstop, the higher the range, the more you need to have your error checked. But unlike shortstop, you don't have it checked twice on a play because you're not making the throw, so it's less critical to have a high error in center field than at shortstop. But it still is somewhat important. Arm has some impact. They're both occasionally going to get used, but range is used in a lot more plays than either error or arm. So, and again, if you have a higher range with center field, you're actually going to be able to make some plays that would be harder for a lower range center fielder easier for you. So overall, it's essentially an easier task at center field to just have more range. That's the primary goal. Another thing, I forgot about this. I said I would give minimum defensive ratings that I'm looking for. At shortstop, 70 range. Not, I wouldn't say this is a hard minimum, but 60 arm. Turn double plays and air variable. It depends. I'm looking for an overall package. That's pretty much just the best I can get. Actually, I won't do the minimum defensive ratings because except for center field. I'll do the outfield, but I won't do anything else because it's kind of I just won't do the infield. I'll do catcher too. It's kind of hard to say because with the infield, there's so many things that go into it that different fielders can be effective, even if they don't necessarily meet certain criteria that I would usually look for. So at second base, range is absolutely the most important thing, followed by turn double plays, which is used quite a few times given the number of opportunities you will likely have from your third baseman and shortstop making plays defensively with a runner on first base. Range is obviously critical because you're getting to more balls as well, and The error check is not as heavy at second base on throws as it is at shortstop. It still has value, but it's not as critical. And the arm at second base is not as important at shortstop because the throws are going to be easier, but still has value because on tougher plays, getting the ball to first base faster can be the difference between an out and a caught runner. But range and turnover plays rank well above error and arm in my eyes at second base. Next up, we got catcher. I'm just going to start by saying 50 to 55 is my minimum catcher ability. If you go below that, you're crippling your pitching staff. It doesn't even matter with the lessened value of framing. It's just horribly, horribly damaging to have a well below average catcher ability. So as I've talked about catcher extensively already, so I'll just keep this brief. Ability has a massive impact on framing. Well, not massive anymore, I would say, but it has a significant impact on framing. It will help your pitching staff be better. It doesn't really tie in anything else, except, of course, your pitching staff's ratings. So very simply put, higher ability is going to be the most impactful thing for a catcher. Now, arm, if you have a pitching staff that universally has really terrible hold runners ratings, it can sometimes help limit your stolen bases. But hold runners is going to be more important in stolen base calculations than arm anyway. And catcher arm just doesn't do enough in my eyes to really justify it being a primary driving defensive rating. It's certainly one of the less valuable ones out there when you look at them from an individual standpoint. Anyways, third base. I mentioned this already as well. Arm, absolutely the most important thing, followed by range. Error, turnover plays, less valuable. Error is at third base reasonably valuable because of some difficult arm checks at times. But it's definitely a secondary rating to arm and range. And turnover plays hardly ever gets used, so you could actually completely ignore it for the most part, and you'll be fine. Right field, 55 minimum range. Range is very important. Arm has a secondary value, helps suppress extra bases more than other positions does, but even then it doesn't have much of a value. Sometimes you'll throw runners out, but again, maybe 10 runners thrown out difference between a really high arm and a low arm. So not critical. The range is really going to help you make the more plays. Error, it's there. It doesn't trigger enough to be particularly valuable, but it's there. And then left field, 55 minimum range, almost always. I will occasionally, and I mean occasionally, go down to 50 range for a truly dominant bat, but almost never lower than that. And ultimately, past that 55, the range hardly matters. It does have an impact, just not huge. So if you want a truly excellent defensive team, definitely go for that, though. The arm has very minimal value. It is used in runner suppression less than center field or right field. And then you've got error, which, again, triggers the least, I think, of any outfield position. Maybe occasionally more than right field, but I don't think error registers enough to be seriously considered for a left fielder. Next up, we got our offensive first positions, first base and DH. Obviously, DH, nothing matters defensively. At first base, I'm generally looking for at least 30 range. I don't care too much about height, so I'm fine playing a shorter person at first base. That 30 range, I really would prefer to have 35 to 40 range at first base, but I can live with the 30 when it's needed. And yeah, really, the range is the only thing that really matters because you'll make a few more plays. Height, I think, impact. I can't actually be totally certain about this. It's kind of hard to tell, but it seems to impact or make other throws easier, slightly easier, so you're a little more likely to make close plays with a greater height. And error, again, occasionally triggers on receiving throws, so it has some effect. It's just not a ton. Anyways, one last thing we need to discuss. And that is how team balance ties into this. So I recently made a video where I discussed why defense is actually much more important for a good team than good offense. And usually that comes down to pitching in real baseball, but in OTP, unlike in real baseball, you can definitely correlate defense to team success. And defense has a much more clear impact on team success, and it has very extreme evident value. So, what does that mean overall? Well, it means that if you are building an extremely talented team, you're probably going to be looking, or even just any team in general, you're going to get more value out of improving your defense than your offense. So those balance positions where you're trying to consider weighing offense versus defense, sometimes defense is going to come on top, even if you're potentially throwing a great hitter out the door. Obviously, there's a minimum offense that you need so that the value of your run prevention is buoyed. Getting that for first base designated hitter is critical. You want some offense from the other positions, and then you just want to go all in on defense when you can. And then you might even be able to save some money at like third base or catcher by going for a greater fielder than a hitter. And then you can spend that on your pitching and increase your run prevention even further. Get to a point where your run prevention is just ridiculously dominant. You're going to see better win percentages and better success overall. So again, I would recommend going for that defense first at the bounce positions more often than not. But they are, of course, there so that you can play to your own style. So if you're looking for offense, totally fine to go for it at those positions. Anyways, you guys, I hope this video was helpful for everybody. Let me know if you have any questions or if you want me to take a look at some fielders. But anyways, I'll see you on the next one, and that'll be all.